This is the first video for AQA GCSE History, Germany 1890 to 1945. The first one is Politics under Kaiser Wilhelm II, so the first unit is before Weimar, before the Nazis. It's when Germany had a king or a Kaiser. So the things that are being talked about here are unification, how that happened, what made Germany Germany essentially, to what extent Wilhelm's personality and how his ability to rule was shaped by his early life, maybe certain events that happened because of his early life, traumas and certain things that we'll be talking about in a second, and how significant the political system in Germany was in actually keeping Wilhelm in power and keeping political stability throughout that time. It did change a lot over this course, so it'd be quite good to compare. And quite an important thing that I should point out here is that this is more of a context video, but you do need to know it still. But you won't get asked a question on anything specifically before 1890. So this builds up. This builds up to 1890, but you won't understand 1890 without these events. So Germany was formed in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. They won it against France, and Germany united. So before that, there are a group of just small independent states, with Prussia being the most dominant. It was a bit like kind of counties. They're all independent states, unrelated, and they were joined together after they won a war against France. Now, quite a credible figure in this was Otto von Bismarck. He was later Chancellor. He was also dismissed by the Kaiser in the 1890s. But Bismarck was one that was credited for this unification of Germany. It was also called the War of Unification as well, because it was a time in which Germany became a unified and definitely much more powerful country, much more significant on the European stage and even the world stage. So going on to the next bit, Wilhelm II, a bit of context on him. He ran the Second Reich. A federal constitution was set up in 1890. The Kaiser became king of Prussia. He then became king of Germany. Kaiser is kind of emperor, king. He had supreme control. No one was more powerful than the Kaiser. We'll go into his strengths and weaknesses in a minute. So he had a traumatic early life. He was born with a birth defect, and he blamed the people that delivered him for that. He had a hatred of certain people in Britain. He really didn't like them. He had a grudge, you could say, against them. Quite an important thing you could say here is that he had an inferiority complex with his cousin George V. They had boat races. He used to come to England every year, and they had boat races, and he was always beaten. He had a bit of a grudge and a bit of a chip on his shoulder against George V. So that could be quite significant in why maybe World War One panned out the way that it did, and why relations with Britain happen the way that they are when we talk about naval laws, which will be done in the next video. But although he did like Queen Victoria, he got on very, very well with Queen Victoria. She spoiled him, and he was actually at her bedside when she died. So he had very, very well sympathised with Victoria, but had an inferiority complex with George V. He was definitely homosexual, so there was a lot of he had a lot of embarrassment about that. He didn't. He was quite closed about that. He didn't really want to talk to anyone. There's a lot of people, if you look at sources, which would be quite good to reference in an exam, saying that he quickly changed personality. He could very quickly go from a calm mood to a very angry one. One of his main aims was to make Germany a military might. He said in a report that he wanted a place in the sun for his country, basically meaning that he wanted Germany to be the dominant power on the international stage. Now, when I start making World War I videos, I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But for that, you just know that they had for this course, you just need to know that they had an important foreign policy, quite an aggressive one, an expansionist, which really gets accelerated by Hitler. But Germany, throughout this, structurally wanted to expand, wanted to be more significant than they were. And then a date that would be quite good for you to jot down would be 1888. He became Kaiser or Emperor of Germany. Now, a bit more about the role of the Kaiser himself and how important that was. Had very extensive powers, you can't deny that. He could appoint or dismiss a chancellor, and he could also dissolve parliament, call for elections. Although he could ignore the Reichstag, which was parliament, he couldn't stop elections. Elections would always go through. He was in charge of the military and foreign policy, and was definitely the most powerful in Germany. But one of his biggest threats was the rise of socialism. There was a lot of political issues in the country at the time. there were a lot of Spartakists, and you had left-wing socialist communists that wanted to bring about a communist revolution, similar to what was seen in Russia in the early 20th century. Germany were very feared that Kaiser was a right-wing person, so he feared this rise of the left and a revolution here. And a lot of people around him were right-wing, so his army officers, people he appointed, they were all right-wing, they all supported him, he didn't really like opposition. So they helped keep him in a position of power, and military officers had to have an oath of loyalty to him. And every 5 years, the Reichstag funded the army. They could not fund the army if they didn't want to, but they usually did. So that's quite an important bit there. But the Reichstag did have powers, but they could be ignored. Now the Chancellor is basically still a Chancellor of Germany today, and they are basically the German version of the British Prime Minister. But the only difference here is that they're unelected and they're appointed by the Kaiser as basically a puppet. They do what the Kaiser says. They're his chief minister. They can also appoint others into that cabinet. They could ignore the Reichstag, and they led the Bundesrat, which I'll go into in a second. So the Chancellor, you could argue, is their importance. They're kind of one of the main figureheads. They kind of carried out what the Kaiser wanted, but they were also unelected, which is an important bit to write. Bismarck was an effective Chancellor before he got dismissed by the Kaiser. He was also known as the Iron Chancellor, which would be quite a good thing to remember. Now the Bundesrat, it was the German Federal Council. It was a bit like the House of Lords, formed of 58 representatives, but the issue here was that the Prussian interest dominated. A lot of people felt left out, that they didn't have a voice, because Prussia dominated all issues here. There was a lot of political instability in Germany, a lot of inequality and unfairness. But the Bundesrat were consulted over policies, and they could propose laws to Parliament. Now, this Parliament was called the Reichstag. It was the elected Parliament, but only by men over 25. This did change when you go into the Weimar years, but for now, only men over 25 could vote. Had 397 deputies, and they could pass, reject, or amend laws. So they kind of acted alongside the Bundesrat in lawmaking and legislation in the country. So they could give or refuse military funding, as I said earlier, but they didn't have much power, but they could pressure the government and influence public opinion, which is very important in seeing what happened to Germany later on and the changes in power, why the Nazis took over eventually. So a major problem here was economic as well as political. Each state could control the taxes that they wanted to pay. So the Kaiser couldn't have a set tax for the whole country. Each state paid a different level of tax. So it was hard for the government to get enough money, and this also caused quite a bit of debt. So this led to growing political problems. So economic and political problems were definitely related, and that's something that you need to remember. An important fact here, you'll be expected to use facts. In 1912, the SDP, which is a left-wing but not a communist movement, were the largest party in the Reichstag. They had 4.25 million votes and 110 seats, with a membership of 1 million people. So it was shown that there was a lot of people calling for political change, liberalism, even socialism in Germany at the time. So just to summarise here, in the next video I'll be going into military and changes in society. There was a lot of political instability. The Kaiser was at times an embarrassing leader, and his personality was definitely shaped by his early life. But the country did become a lot more powerful, and it did accelerate under the Kaiser. But the constitution of Germany did have issues. It had revenue, which was economic, and the power of the Kaiser, which was political. And this is really important to remember. Now, German foreign policy was quite aggressive. They had an expansionist idea. They feared something called encirclement, feeling that they were kind of being trapped in by the nations. And democracy was not very effective at all, as the Kaiser had ultimate control. He could ignore Parliament. People didn't really have a voice. So in the next video I'll be going into more about the military and society and what happened there. But this is just a quick context video for the first lesson in GCSE 9-1 History, Germany 1890 to 1945. Please remember to subscribe to see more of these, and I'll post another video very soon.